welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the place where we take these big, interesting topics and, well, we really try to unpack them for you, give you the core understanding without you needing to wade through tons of research yourself.
That's the plan.
And today, we're taking a journey back in time. We're looking at the connection, the historical link between music and healing.
Right, across different ancient literate cultures.
Yeah.
It's a story that goes way back, really to the beginning of written history.
Our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to figure out how these ancient societies actually saw music in relation to health. You know, what did their thinkers, their doctors, their scholars believe?
Exactly. We want to get past just the anecdotes. Those are interesting too, and see what the learned traditions said.
And we're going to focus initially on three big ones: Greece and Rome, the medieval Arab world, and ancient India. We'll touch on China too, maybe briefly.
Yeah.
And the big question, I suppose, is, was music like a central part of ancient medicine? Was it something doctors prescribed?
Or was it more conceptual? Maybe something on the edges of what they considered actual medicine. That's what we want to explore.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start? Even before Greece.
Well, yeah, before we get into those main cultures, it's worth thinking about the possibility that this connection goes back even further, like prehistoric times.
Okay.
We could imagine music being used maybe magically for healing in places like ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt. The trouble is, we don't have much specific written evidence from that far back, before classical antiquity really starts.
But it feels intuitive, doesn't it? The idea that early humans might have linked sound and, well, something beyond the ordinary. Think about the first instruments. Drums from animal skins, right? A hunter's bowstring twanging, flutes made out of bone, animal horns.
Yeah, the materials themselves.
It seems almost natural they might think those sounds were, I don't know, the voices of the spirits of those animals. What would that imply?
That's a really interesting way to put it. There's this idea that the sounds weren't just made by the instrument, but were somehow intrinsic to it. Voices of the materials, maybe spirits within them.
Huh.
The shaman's drum is a classic example, isn't it? Often seen as a way to talk to the spirit world, maybe influence it, travel spiritually.
Right.
And the parts of the drum, the wood, the skin, they were thought to have their own story, their own voice.
That's fascinating. And you see hints of that later on, too, maybe more metaphorically. Like the story of Hermes making the lyre from a tortoise shell.
Right, like the dead tortoise is singing.
Or even that, that medieval folktale about the flute made from someone's bone that reveals the murderer by singing.
Yeah, those stories linger. They might not be literal beliefs by that point, but they point back to that old idea. The instrument holding a voice, maybe from somewhere else.
So it suggests music wasn't just something people invented, but had deeper, maybe even supernatural origins in their minds.
I think that's fair to say. And within that kind of thinking, the shaman figure often emerges. The shaman is often portrayed as this early healer figure, using music, rhythm, chanting.
To connect to spirits for healing.
Exactly. To mediate with the spirit world for therapeutic ends. We don't have detailed records of exactly how prehistoric shamans used music for healing, but the tradition itself, which still exists in some places,
right,
it points to a really ancient link between music, ritual, and trying to deal with illness spiritually.
Okay, so let's move into ancient Greece then. We have those amazing legends, Amphion building Thebes' walls with his lyre song,
right,
Orpheus charming absolutely everything, even going down to the underworld. These myths definitely show the Greeks believed music had immense power.
Oh, absolutely. They show a deep respect for music's ability to influence the world. But it's interesting. Orpheus has this incredible power, right? Over nature, gods, the dead.
Yeah.
But we don't really have big stories about him specifically curing diseases with his music. There are mentions of maybe therapeutic incantations linked to him.
Okay.
But the main Orpheus myth isn't really focused on curing sickness, which suggests that while music was seen as super powerful, using it for physical ailments wasn't necessarily the main thing they thought about in those stories.
Right. And when we do look at Greek healing practices, we find incantations, like in the Odyssey, stopping Odysseus's wound from bleeding. But the understanding is those worked because of the words, the spell itself, not necessarily the musical quality, even though incantation sort of implies singing. What's the difference there?
That's a key distinction. Those incantations were basically verbal magic. They might have been chanted or spoken rhythmically, sure, but the power was thought to be in the words, the formula.
Not the tune.
Not the tune or the rhythm, no. The power was semantic. A more clearly musical form connected to well-being was something called the paean.
Ah, the paean, that was like a group hymn, a sacred song.
Yeah, communal, often addressed to Apollo or Asclepius.
And used for purification, especially when there was disease, like a plague. I remember reading about Philetus coming to Sparta.
7th century BC, yeah.
Hmm.
During a plague, his paeans supposedly helped.
And those women in southern Italy, Locri and Regium, suffering from some kind of madness, they were told to sing paeans too. So how did that work? How did the music heal?
Well, in those cases, the idea seems to be that the paean worked by appeasing the god who was thought to be causing the problem.
Ah, so it wasn't directly affecting the sick people's bodies.
Not directly, no.
No.
It was about restoring the community's relationship with the divine, purification.
Yeah.
But there is that interesting story about Pythagoras,
Okay.
reportedly using paeans with his lyre, specifically to calm his students, bring them into a more tranquil state. That sounds a bit more like a direct effect on mood or mind.
Right, which brings us squarely to Pythagoras. Most people just think geometry, the theorem.
A squared plus b squared.
Yeah, but he was way more than that, wasn't he? A kind of spiritual figure, mystical belief.
Definitely. Transmigration of the soul, that sort of thing. And his views on music were really influential.
What made them so important? Was it the math connection?
That was huge, yes. The discovery, or at least the highlighting, that musical harmonies, the consonant intervals like the octave, the fifth, the fourth, could be expressed as simple whole number ratios.
Like 2.1, 3.2, 4.3.
Exactly. For Pythagoras and his followers who believed number was the basis of everything, the whole cosmos, this was massive. It suggested music wasn't just pleasing sound, it was plugged into the fundamental structure of reality.
Wow. So because the soul was also seen as having some kind of harmony or structure,
Which they also linked to number.
then music could directly affect the soul through these shared mathematical principles.
That was precisely the idea. It provided this rational, quantifiable link, and it led them to believe music could have a direct, almost measurable impact on your inner state.
So they actually used it therapeutically.
It seems so, yes.
Yeah.
Within Pythagorean groups, we hear about systematic uses. Aristoxenus, writing later, so they use medicine for the body and music for the soul.
Okay.
There are accounts of specific songs or lyre melodies used in the morning to get the mind ready for the day, make it alert.
And in the evening,
To soothe anxieties, encourage good sleep. Iamblichus even mentions specific tunes to counteract specific negative emotions like despair, anger.
really targeted.
Yeah. And there's that great anecdote about Cleinias, a Pythagorean around 400 BC. Whenever he felt himself getting angry, he'd pick up his lyre and play, saying, I'm calming myself.
Just playing to cool down. That suggests a very practical application for emotional regulation.
It does.
And they had strong preferences for instruments too, didn't they? Lyre good, allos bad.
Very strong. The lyre, with its clear consonant notes, was seen as promoting order, harmony fitting their whole philosophy.
And the aulos, that reed pipe.
Seen as vulgar, disruptive, maybe too passionate, too wild. There's even a story that Pythagoras told his followers to basically purify their ears if they heard an aulos.
Wow. So different music had different ethical characters for them.
Absolutely. It wasn't just sound. It had specific qualities that could either help or hinder your soul's harmony.
Okay, moving on a bit. These ideas about music's power, especially its ethical power, really get picked up by thinkers like Damon and Plato.
Damon especially.
Damon's theory that musical modes and rhythms directly shape character. That's pretty radical. He thought the state should control music education.
Yeah, essentially as a public health measure for the soul. He argued that specific modes and rhythms had inherent ethical qualities, courage, moderation, or the opposite.
So listening to the wrong music could make you a bad citizen.
That was the fear.
Yeah.
He believed music directly formed character, especially in the young, so the state needed to make sure everyone was listening to the right stuff to foster virtue and social stability.
And Plato, who was influenced by Damon, he runs with this idea too, right? In the Republic, for instance.
Absolutely. Plato takes it very seriously. He also believed musical patterns could imprint themselves on the soul, bringing order if the music was orderly.
And he also favored specific modes, the Dorian and Phrygian.
Yes. He thought the Dorian mode fostered courage and moderation, while the Phrygian was associated with necessary enthusiasm, perhaps. Warlike spirit, maybe.
So, like Damon, he saw music education as crucial for shaping good citizens.
Definitely. Just like gymnastics trained the body, the right music trained the soul. He wanted to ban modes he thought promoted softness or lamentation. It was about building the character needed for his ideal state.
And then in the Timaeus, Plato talks about harmonia and rhythm actually restoring order to a troubled soul. That sounds more directly therapeutic, less just educational.
Yes, that's a key passage. He suggests that when the soul's inner harmonies are disrupted, listening to musical harmony and observing rhythm can help retune it, bring it back into alignment with the cosmic order.
It's like using music as a tool for inner healing. And isn't there that story about Pythagoras, or maybe it was Damon?
Yes, the one about the young men getting rowdy after hearing Phrygian music.
Right, excited and unruly.
And Pythagoras, or Damon, supposedly gets the musician to switch to the sober, steady Dorian mode, and they immediately calm down.
That really highlights the belief in the immediate, almost mechanical effect of different modes, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests they thought you could predictably alter someone's emotional state and behavior just by changing the music. Not just long-term character building, but instant mood control.
And wasn't there a student of Plato's, Xenocrates?
Xenocrates of Chalcedon, yes.
Yeah.
He reportedly used instrumental music, just the sounds, no words, to treat people suffering from hysterics.
Which is significant because it's attributing the cure just to the music itself for a recognized condition.
Exactly. It pushes beyond just general emotional influence or character building towards something that looks more like targeted therapy for a specific ailment, using music alone.
Okay, so we've got these powerful myths, this deep philosophical interest from Pythagoras to Plato, linking music, math, the cosmos, the soul, ethics, even direct emotional control.
A really rich seam of thought.
So you'd think music therapy would be all over ancient Greek and Roman medicine, wouldn't you?
Logically, yes, but that's where it gets tricky. Because when you actually look at the big names in mainstream Greek and Roman medical writing, Hippocrates, Galen, the foundational figures, they barely mention using music for healing. It's strikingly absent from their core therapeutic approaches.
Really? After all that philosophical groundwork?
It's a real disconnect. Some later medical writers in antiquity even flat out say music therapy is useless for many conditions.
So what happened? Why didn't the doctors pick up on what the philosophers were saying?
It seems the medical tradition largely focused elsewhere, on diet, exercise, herbs, surgery, things they perhaps saw as more direct interventions for physical problems.
Right, more tangible things.
Perhaps. In Roman times, you do get some mild suggestions for using music, but it's usually alongside pleasant things like good wine or nice conversation, mostly for troubles of the mind, like melancholy.
So more like a mood booster, a pleasant distraction.
Kind of. A gentle comfort, maybe, but not a frontline medical treatment for specific diseases. So the overall picture for classical antiquity seems to be music therapy, big in philosophy, not so much in mainstream medicine.
That's a really important distinction. Okay, let's shift gears and head east to the medieval Arab world. You said earlier music therapy seemed a bit more prominent there.
Yes, it appears so. The medieval Islamic medical world inherited and built upon a lot of Greek learning, but they seem to have given music therapy a bit more weight, both in theory and apparently in practice.
How so?
We find references to music being used in doctors' consulting rooms and even in the big hospitals, the bimeristans, especially for patients with mental illnesses.
Okay, that's definitely different from the Greek and Roman medical mainstream. Was there a specific theoretical reason for this in Arab medicine?
They developed quite sophisticated theories about attuning the individual to their environment, drawing on and expanding the Greek idea of ethos music's power over character and emotion. They linked musical modes to times of day, astrological influences, temperaments.
A more integrated system?
It seems that way, although it's worth noting, even with prominent physicians like Al-Razi, who wrote extensively, detailed case notes specifically about using music are still pretty rare.
Okay.
And you even had scholars back then like Ibn Hindu who seemed to feel that true musical healing, maybe the kind the ancients knew, was already a lost art.
Huh. So even while using it, they felt maybe they weren't using it to its full potential, or that something profound had been lost.
That's one interpretation. It suggests a kind of reverence for the past, maybe for those Pythagorean ideas, combined with the practical reality of using music where they could, especially for mental and emotional conditions in those hospitals.
Right. Now let's jump further east again to ancient India. You mentioned parallels with Greece here too.
Yes, some interesting similarities. Again, you find a lot of theory about music's effects. There's a concept very much like the Greek ethos, the idea that different musical forms, different ragas, can evoke specific emotions or influence character. And you also get plenty of stories about music's amazing power over nature, making rain fall, charming animals, that kind of thing.
So, lots of belief in music's power. But what about in actual medicine? In Ayurveda?
Well, when you look at the main classical texts of Ayurveda, music doesn't feature very heavily as a specific treatment. It's mentioned more as part of creating a generally beneficial environment for the patient.
So, similar to the Roman idea of pleasant surroundings. Good for general well-being, but not a targeted therapy.
That seems to be the picture from the core texts that survive. It's part of the non-naturals concept, things like air, food, sleep, emotions, environment, that all influence health overall.
Oh, didn't you mention a lost text?
Ah, yes. There's this tantalizing mention of a lost manuscript that was supposedly all about raga therapeutics, using specific ragas to treat specific conditions.
Wow, so there might have been a more developed system of musical medicine?
There might have been, but since the text is lost, we just don't know what it contained. It's a frustrating gap.
Okay, and briefly, China. You mentioned their culture having an inherently therapeutic aspect, focused on balance and harmony.
Right. Chinese thought emphasizes harmony within the body, between the person and the cosmos. Music was definitely seen as important for social harmony and ethical development.
And they linked music to cosmology, too.
Yes, through concepts like the five phases, Wu Jing, and their corresponding emotions. The Yu Ji, the classic text on music, talks about music calming the mind and balancing feelings. So all the ingredients seem to be there.
But again, the actual medical texts.
Similar story. Lots about music's role in society, ritual, ethics, even influencing nature and anecdotes, but less explicit detail in the main medical canons about using specific musical pieces to cure specific diseases.
So it seems like a pattern emerges as we look across these ancient literate cultures.
It does seem that way. As you move eastwards across Eurasia, the concrete evidence for music being a central part of formal learned medicine, as opposed to philosophy or general wellness, seems to diminish somewhat.
So a widespread philosophical fascination, a belief in its power over the soul, emotions, even nature.
Definitely.
But maybe less integration into the day-to-day practice of medicine, especially for physical illness, than we might initially expect.
I think that's a fair assessment based on the core medical texts we have. Now, that's not to say it wasn't used at all. We do find more specific examples, especially if we look back towards the later Roman period.
Oh, like what?
Well, Cicero's friend Diodotus apparently used lyre music to relax. Asclepiades of Bithynia, a physician, supposedly used symphonia, maybe ensemble music, for patients with phrenitis, mental disturbance, and even tried trumpet blasts for deafness.
Trumpet blasts for deafness. Interesting approach.
A bit counterintuitive, maybe. And Maecenas, the famous patron of arts, apparently used soft music to help him sleep.
Okay, so some specific therapeutic uses there.
And Celsus, another Roman writer, recommended symphoniae, and even the noise of cymbals for tristes cogitationes, basically, depression or persistent sad thoughts. He linked this to ecstatic rites like those of Bacchus.
So, using stimulating sound to shake someone out of melancholy?
Potentially, yeah. And much later, Emperor Justin II was said to be soothed by organ music during bouts of mental illness. Other physicians, like Rufus of Ephesus, suggested music for lovesickness, and Serenus considered how all his music affected mood. Even Galen acknowledged music could impact ethos and health generally.
So there are these mentions scattered through Roman times.
There are, but again, they often feel a bit anecdotal or secondary compared to the main medical treatments: diet, exercise, drugs, surgery. Mainstream medicine seems to have remained largely focused elsewhere, often dismissing music therapy for physical problems.
So if it wasn't the doctors keeping the idea alive, who was? Where did the enduring interest come from?
It seems it was sustained much more by the philosophical traditions, especially the Pythagorean and Platonic streams, and also by writers specifically interested in music theory, musicology, we might call it now.
Ah, so the philosophers and music theorists kept exploring it.
Exactly. They kept developing the ideas about the mathematical basis of music, its connection to the cosmos. Plato's Harmony of the Spheres is part of this.
Right.
Later thinkers like Ptolemy analyzed the soul's faculties and tried to map them onto musical intervals and concords.
Trying to create a precise map between music and the psyche.
Yes. And Aristides Quintilianus, writing maybe in the 3rd century AD, developed an incredibly elaborate theory connecting cosmic harmony, the human soul, seen as a kind of musical attunement itself, and how earthly music could influence that soul attunement.
Wow, that sounds complex.
It is. These theories provided a kind of ongoing philosophical respectability for the idea that music should have profound effects, even if doctors weren't widely prescribing it for fevers or broken bones.
So the idea remained powerful, even if the practice wasn't widespread in medicine.
That seems to be the case. And this philosophical and theoretical interest gets passed down.
Through figures like Boethius.
Exactly. Boethius, writing in the early 6th century, his work, De Institutione Musica, on the principles of music, was incredibly influential in the Middle Ages.
And he passed on those ancient ideas.
He did. He retold many of those classic stories. Pythagoras calming the mob, Terpander healing the Spartans, Ismenias supposedly curing sciatica with music.
Sciatica? Really?
That's one of the stories Boethius includes. He also repeats the Pythagorean practices of morning and evening music, the connection between music and the pulse, the power of lullabies.
So he basically compiled all the greatest hits about music's power.
In a way, yes. His work was hugely persuasive and really cemented the idea for medieval thinkers that music was fundamentally important and deeply connected to the human mind body.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Summing up our deep dive today, what's the main takeaway?
I think the key takeaway is that while music clearly held this really significant conceptual and philosophical weight in many ancient literate societies,
Right, they thought about it a lot.
its actual role as a frontline mainstream medical therapy, especially for physical illnesses, seems to have been, well, pretty marginal overall.
There's a gap between the philosophical idea and the medical practice documented in the core texts.
Exactly. Plenty of theory, fascinating anecdotes, philosophical respectability, but less evidence of it being systematically integrated into formal medical treatment protocols compared to things like diet or drugs.
Okay, so that leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought, perhaps.
Yeah, given this history, this disconnect sometimes between the powerful idea of musical healing and its documented medical application in antiquity, why do you think humans have this enduring fascination with music's healing power?
That's a great question. What keeps that belief so strong across cultures and time, even when formal medicine maybe wasn't fully on board back then?
And how does understanding this history, this interplay between belief, philosophy, and what counted as evidence then, shape how we think about music therapy today? Something for you to ponder.